Hello,
Okay,
everyone. I'll do a little introduction just to
sure.
start up. Just to say thank you really for joining the breakout session on risk culture. So this will follow on from the main session and it will take a closer look at risk culture and the role of the finance professional. My name's Gordon. I'm the Sectors and Communities Manager for ACCA covering financial services. I have several of my ACCA sectors and communities colleagues on the call today. I'm sure they'll put their LinkedIn profiles in the chat. I would recommend that you do the same, and that will allow you to connect offline as well. This is a bit more of an interactive discussion than the panel discussion was. We'd really love to hear your thoughts either by coming off mute or by using the chat box. Please do turn on your camera if at all possible, but pop yourself on mute if you're not talking. If you'd like to join the discussion, please use the raise your hand function, which you can find alongside at the top of the screen. So to kick off the session, I will hand over to Rachel.
Sure. Um, well, I did send some slides. I didn't know if we wanted to show any slides or if people wanted to ask questions about the report, if they've had looked through it and had more questions specifically on risk culture. Um, I can start by maybe just giving it some kind of key highlights, overview of what we found, and then people hopefully will raise their hand and join in. Um, I mean, as I mentioned, there was no doubts in my mind really. Um, yep. Oh, yep. There was no doubt really after all of the events that we were talking, as I mentioned, on the Global Forum for Governance, Risk and Performance and with the CROs, that it just made sense going into 2022 to do a deep dive on risk culture. And at the time, we kind of thought, well, we were coming out of the pandemic, and but we know we were rethinking everything, how we approach risk, the all the disruption in the way we behave, the way we consume, work, communicate. It was that whole everything everywhere all at once. But little did we know, once we put the special interest group together, we were going to be, there was going to be a war, and how once again everything that was happening was going to be accelerated by another gear. So we really it was really a fascinating time, and the events that unfolded as we were doing our research, and it was astounding how we could explore the behavior changing disruption, what it meant to our members, how it affected their attitudes and appetites for risk at their organization. From a back to kind of a finance team perspective, again in the risk conversations, it was really interesting for us to see across the many different roles and hierarchies, where our members come from, how those attitudes and appetites and frustrations varied. We saw younger people in finance teams feeling very frustrated to not be involved with how risk appetite was articulated, because there was clearly an overconfidence that we thought in the online survey, where maybe almost 80% said they had an understanding, believed they had a good understanding of their risk appetite. But once we got into these conversations, did we realize most of them, apart from the senior management or risk leaders in charge of them, didn't really understand how they were being employed. So it was really interesting to get the inside story about all of the online, more quantitative findings, and how we explained, what we saw happening. We talked about the sheer scale of the unknowns and the rapid transformations. And so we knew that there was going to be more than how do we build a risk culture? How do we define a strong risk culture? What is a weak risk culture? We found that a weak risk culture was even better than having none. But it was also through all of our, our conversations and roundtables that we recognized that there isn't a right or wrong risk culture, and that we really needed to pick the different aspects, as we did today in the panel discussion too. We talked about ethics and trust, and we talked a lot about ESG plus the T squared, with trust and rapid technological advancements and adoptions. And we have a section on leadership as well. So there was also how do we keep things in line, purpose, risk appetite, those values. and all very much easier said than done. And when you got into the conversations, really did you understand, what the challenges truly are and what finance professionals can do to help them with their objectives. See if there's any other questions. We could pull up the deck, Gordon, because it would make me sort of think about something more of a flow to discuss things, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
So as I mentioned, our reach was really unlike anything that's been done before, one of a kind, and we were able to compare a lot across. Maybe go to the second one there, please. Yeah. Or sorry, yeah. Okay, yeah. It would really helped us to really be able to compare the nuances across industries, and that's why too we are going to be building on a series of mini special reports about what's happening in different industries. We mentioned sort of what happens in the aviation industry, where one of our members of the special interest group on a webinar in Europe talked about fortunately do not see planes dropping out of the sky, but how they all work together in terms of speaking up and sharing information globally, this industry, but how forgive the pun, how they have their own risk challenges down on the ground with all of the data leaks and customer services issues that really during the pandemic caused a lot of reputational risk and damage for those. And then we also have some examples in healthcare, and healthcare is scheduled into one of the series of special reports, where, for example, in the US, unfortunately, because of the fear of malpractice suits, there's just this culture of fear of speaking up, and it definitely, depending on the organization, the hospital, for example, the type of language that they're speaking, where again, accountancy professionals can help try to make sure people are singing from the same song sheet, and that there are governance processes and frameworks in there to help those kind of issues be resolved. So as I mentioned, our reach was more than the World Economic Forums, and what's even more interesting for us, I think, is we are including our responses, our questions, in our global economic conditions surveys every quarter. So therefore, we'll be able to benchmark the data and by quarter and really get an idea of where risk is evolving, and what priorities are. So kind of gauging that sentiment in the accountancy profession, which is really exciting for us globally as a profession, because we'll again be able to break down by country. And there were some interesting comparisons across companies and sectors and countries. So I think Jane mentioned that we did learn that of the 9 options, when asked what are your top 3 risk priorities, regulatory change, legal, and compliance had the most highest score. The only country that didn't have it as the highest score, it had it in its top 3, was USA, that is, that had it as cyber risk as top. And what we were able to find is that in the quarterly ones, economic and recession, inflation worries, which was even though regulatory change was the highest in the UK had the most votes for economic recession and inflation. That was in October 2022 when we first conducted the survey. In the Q1 GEX, that fell out of the top 3, and it was talent scarcity that came in. And again, UK had that as had the most votes for talent scarcity. So you can see some of the interesting movements that we'll be able to report to you all as members. Great, I see a hand up. Val, please turn on your mic and let us in your video if you want, and share us your question or thoughts.
Thanks, Rachel. I am concerned that, again, risk culture, risk management is coming back to compliance very much. And I do get, regulatory, it's got to be, high up on the list. But again, finance are being seen as the police people of all of this. And I haven't read your report, but I'm just picking up from the summary around risk culture is important for building resilience and seizing opportunities. And that's why I think sometimes we're not spending enough time talking about that. How do we utilize it to seize opportunities? Because you have to take a certain amount of risk, in my opinion, in order to drive growth. Our innovators of the world are the people who take a bit more risk, who disrupt the marketplace. So, and you keep coming back to the old Kodak thing, where the board sat there and said, oh, we don't want to disrupt our camera sales, so we're not going to go digital. Whereas actually that would have been the right thing to do. So I'm kind of in this, how do we as accountants, instead of just going compliance, 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 we've got internal controls, great. How do we really get that, seize the opportunities part of this?
Yeah, I'm going to give it to Jane, but before I would hand it over to her, there she is right there in the report. Well, that was from Rethinking Risk, but we talk about it in the risk culture, don't we, Jane, about really a strong risk culture. You will be able to, by consequence, deal with those kind of regulatory changes and compliance requirements and the costs. So there's a great read in there, Val, but thanks for the question, and I'll pass it to the expert.
Val, it's a really good question, and I think that from my money as a risk professional, because I'm also an accountant as well, but as a risk professional, it's really because we often get risk management wrong, because risk is just the effect of uncertainty on our objectives. And I sort of start every conversation I have, if I'm going into a workshop, with that thought, because actually then everything becomes relevant to our objectives, so you know what scope you're looking at. And uncertainty is both threat and opportunity, so you should be asking, well, what might come in the way? What are the threats to me meeting my objectives? But also, how might I achieve my objectives better? What are the opportunities that we might be missing? And I just love your mention of Kodak, because did you know, I'm sure you probably do, but I wonder if the audience knows that I think it was in 1971, they actually developed the first prototype for a digital camera. And they buried it deep in their R&D department because they thought it would threaten their business model. Now, one of the things I love doing as a risk workshop is to get the senior leadership together and say to them, okay, imagine it's whatever time horizon you want to think of, but say it's 3 years, if that's your typical planning one, or if you're maybe looking at something like climate change, you're looking longer out. But I'd like you to imagine we're in, say, 3, 5, 10 years time, and the business has failed. What was the cause? So we call it a pre-mortem. But what you lean into there are, what were the business disruptors that came along and put us out of business? And then that leans into, what might our competitors be looking at that we're not doing? What are the opportunities that we're missing? And I have seen business models change as a result of that conversation. So I'd really recommend that as well, to start talking more about opportunities. You can frame it in a negative way, or you could frame it in a positive way. But the negative way somehow seems to get people thinking more. Maybe it makes them a bit more nervous. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we talk about how risk culture can be a threat or a competitive advantage. And, here we talk about culture eats strategy for breakfast, which came up a lot. And we see firsthand with the many Kodaks since 1971, the ones many since 2021. The phrase was originally, I think it's from a management consultant called Peter Drucker in 2006, but it was actually made famous by a guy called Mark Fields, who later became the chief executive of Ford Motor Company. And that's where he really kind of explained what it actually means, that any company that disconnects risk and culture, or culture and strategy, puts its success at risk. Sorry. And so it is, a bit of an adage. I think too, we talked in the panel discussion about the different behaviors. We learned a lot about what's happening, particularly in banks, where they're having a lot more regulatory forces on looking at conduct and culture. And so we had in the report lots of different visuals about those behaviors associated with good and those with bad. And there's some good stories about behavioral risk management teams at banks, but there's also a lot are doing it because it is fashionable. There's a woman, Mira from ING, who was really pioneering it there, and because the Dutch central bank has been kind of behind this for the longest, and they did a really great summary of how they've incorporated behavior risk analysis in their banking system in January. It is a one-page, and it's worth going to DNB, their central bank, looking at that, and we reference it in the report. But I saw her in London 2 weeks ago for a risk conference, and her presentation was all about being able to get the buy-in, because there is a lot happening with behavioral risks and things that AI can do, and there's some issues about data privacy and so on, but it's changing really fast. And she said it's really frustrating how it has so much to do with how you detect and plan for it better, and it is really the future of risk management. So the behavioral side and in the report is really worth reading as well. It was really for us to get to, again, just talking to the different roles. And I remember in one of the when we had our talks, Jane, just how do we decide what these different roles are? I mean, it is, some companies have chief risk officers, mostly from regulated industries. Some have a head of risk, some have ones for different types of risk. But us being able to look across those different ones and really making some sense of what is it saying about risk leaders, it was fascinating. And we really concluded that they are isolated at the top. They do often find the buy-in from the CEO, and even though those, not always a CRO will be reporting to the board, but a head of risk might not. And like you say, Val, be pushed into more of a compliance role, a firefighter, than it is actually a value added, involved with strategy and informing it. So see what else move through. As we mentioned, more than half the respondents did say that the pandemic got them to rethink, and they thought that they actually thought about risk culture for the first time, or was doing something about it before the pandemic, which was really encouraging. But like we said, we found that the third or so that were doing assessments, they weren't really sure what they were doing with them, and that was an area that we did. There's actually a section in the appendix about what to do and not to do when it comes to making those assessments. Just some thoughts from another person on the risk culture group about the biases and surveys and so on. And again, what you can be doing in terms of automating and accessing new technologies that in the long run is more efficient, and in terms of costs, and in getting the detections of the risks and being able to do something about them. Let's see, go on, given the time. So this was just one of the visualizations that allowed us to compare that first question, which is now in the GEX, and we'll be putting out in every GEX report. So I'll be contributing a couple paragraphs to show what this means. And like I said, for the UK, we noticed more than any how they had in the original one, they had the highest amount of mentions in that question for economic inflation recession, and that fell out in the Q1, and we're only analyzing the Q2 responses. But that talent scarcity, which came in fourth, it was moved up to third, and economic inflation recession fourth. Across sector, it was really interesting. We talked a lot about fraud in the panel discussion, rightly so, and interestingly, the corporate sector put it the lowest. So they were the least concerned about internal, external fraud. But as you can see, and I put in the chat room of the main discussion, there's so much out there, more and more that's coming out, and that's the report that I put in there was suggesting that that isn't even a small proportion of what's actually happening. So it definitely is a material risk that we need to work on more. I know this one isn't about cyber, but the cyber risk was something that was in every conversation we had. There were some really interesting conversations in Europe where some of the directives, EU directives. I know we're not in the EU anymore, but I'm just going to mention it because it brought up some good food for thought, where some of the directives were suggesting that companies need to have zero tolerance, and we joked that there is no such thing. And also we had a great session in our global forum. Do you remember Jane from CIO office? And he was saying that, you know, that's just being foolish. It's not a matter of if, it's when. And we had companies really expressing, being very candid about the fact that they threw so much money at it in 2020 just to be able to enable their digitalization capabilities to stay afloat and move with what the times that were happening. And then 2 years later found out that they just weren't getting the benefits that they thought they were by investing. And so when they were doing risk assessments, they were really looking at the fact that it's really difficult to do an aggregated risk report, and that you had to scope these things more, and not to necessarily silo the risks or classify them, but scope it more. So like maybe doing one line and then the second line, third line, or doing this team or that team. So again, really interesting stories for you to read in the report from the risk conversations. We talked a little bit, I thought, Jane, you talked a lot really well about, you know, what does critical thinking mean? It's becoming kind of like that word unprecedented in 2020. We're all using it so much in the risk space, but it really resonates with accountancy professionals, because it is about what Roger, in the next episode of the Risk Culture podcast series, talks about foraging for the truth, which I thought was really brilliant, because it is about, you know, what we don't know, and we have to ask uncomfortable questions. And yes, we're overwhelmed, but we're at a period of time where, you know, we can't just look at the information in front of us and think, okay, this is what we have, you know, this is all we're going to deal with here. And I think AI is going to be changing. I've heard things about sampling that it does, and just already what I've heard some banks are doing to detect trends. It's fascinating. So I think, you know, there's a lot of opportunities there to get to do that foraging, if you like. Before I keep kind of plowing through, is there anyone else who wants to chime in or ask a question about, you know, what we found, or are all of you coming from the risk side of the accountancy profession, or the tech or governance? Probably unsurprising to most of you, we found even across the risk leaders or the different roles that different functions were speaking different languages about risk. However, we did find a lot of there was a clear will to want to improve, and a clear will from, you know, even though we did partner with 2 trade associations, trade associations, 97% of the respondents were ACCA members, so therefore had an accountancy background. And we found that will to improve was really interesting, because they seemed to be wanting to be more relevant when it came to risk, whether they were in an actual risk role or not, which was really encouraging. And just to put that into context, both those trade associations were brilliant, but we are hundreds of thousands, and AirMix 8,000, and Premia maybe 40,000. Jane, do you want to add something? You have your hand up, so I don't know if that was from before or.
You know, I put my hand up, Rachel, and then you moved on, and I've forgotten what it was I was actually going to say. I'm sorry about that. But it was, oh gosh, how embarrassing. No, I'm just trying to think. What were you saying just now about? I love the expression foraging for truth.
Mm-hmm.
So using AI to look at the data. I mean, yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? I get the sense that, you know, AI at the moment probably only looks for what you ask it to look for. So it might be just as risk blind as a person looking at data. And there's no substitute for the incredible training that we have in the ACCA, and the knowledge and experience that we have as individuals when we're looking at data or evidence for things. And then, of course, risk is all about uncertainty and the unknown and looking into the future. So you're not, you know, you won't have as much evidence because you're considering things that might happen. Because if it's not uncertain, it's not a risk. If you're certain about it, it's a fact, or it's evidence, or it's an issue, or something that's already happening, or it might be part of your context. But a risk is uncertain, and so you're looking into the future, and it's a very different skill set. And I remember what I was going to say now, in that it's actually when I was first asked 17 years ago to move into a risk management role from an accountancy background, I felt very uncomfortable because it was all about the narrative. And of course, numbers are lovely because you know if they add up or not, you know if they're wrong or they're right, and you can find out why they don't. And it's true that numbers tell us things as well. So there is narrative in the reports that we do as accountants. But the risk management side for me was all about the narrative, which is a much grayer area. So you're much less certain and confident in what you're reporting. And I think that's the space, particularly now with the ISSB leaning into the sustainability standards, with S1 and S2 coming out. Accountants are going to need to get much more comfortable with that grey area and really sort of looking into those uncertain areas and saying, you know, as we do when we make estimates, well, okay, normally when we make estimates, we have to be reasonably certain about them, but we need to now be comfortable about talking about things that we're really not certain about at all.
Indeed.
So that was my two penneth.
Thank you for sharing. That's good one. Okay, so we just have a couple minutes, and Barbara, you have your hand up, and we'll end up with you.
Very quick last couple of minutes. I'm Barbara Mangan, Yorkshire Water. I'm coming at this from an internal audit perspective, which is why I've joined it. And our CEO for this year asked us to add themes to all our internal audits, and one of the themes is risk culture. So we're not auditing risk culture, but as we're going about our everyday audit plan, we have to keep half an eye out for risk culture. If I'm honest, not quite sure what I'm looking out for. So has anybody got any insights with, you know, if has anybody tried to audit risk culture, but so say not as a standalone audit of culture, because we've tried that, we've abandoned that, we don't do that. Any thoughts in the last 30 seconds?
So Barbara, I go back to what I was saying earlier in the discussion. If your company's saying anything about itself, either externally or internally, about its aims and the way it does things, so if they're saying things like people are our most valued asset, when you're having your conversations, you're testing that and saying, you know, do you feel valued in your team or whatever? And then if you experience, and you'll find different cultures in different areas of the organisation. But if in, for example, sewage, you're finding you're finding that people are saying, no, I don't feel at all valued, then that's a cultural red flag to the team, because they're saying, well, this is the company line, this is our appetite around this risk. And you're finding mismatches in the culture, and often it's really interesting to ask those questions. Have the conversation with the board, have the conversation with your audit committee, and have the conversation with your teams and see where the mismatches and the gaps are. That would be my best advice.
And there are, there clearly are.
So Barbara, also the Financial Markets Standards Board here in the UK, they're doing a lot, and you know, that's in the financial markets, but just like what Dawn was saying, very applicable to non-financial corporates out of our jurisdiction. But New York Fed, if you go to the New York Fed, they do a regular free blog and webinar series, podcast series led by a guy called James Hennessy. They are doing a lot on auditing risk culture as well. So I'm sorry we're at the end, but those are my last two sort of things to add, I guess.
Well, thanks very much for Rachel for your input in today. It's been really interesting, and to everyone who joined in the discussions. I have put in the chat all of the link to all of the risk reports that ACCA has done. There's a lot of them. I think Rachel has been involved in most of them. Sorry.
I mean, I'm sure Jane wouldn't mind too, but if for me, please feel free to contact me in for anything outside of today. Happy to have a chat or recommend any other sort of resources outside of what we've done as well. And Jane, she's on the special interest group in the Global Forum. I know she's very busy, but
I'd be delighted. You know, if anyone's got any questions, do reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn, or you can contact me via Rachel. Sorry, Rachel, that's probably not ideal, is it? Contact me via LinkedIn. You can find me on there.
No, thanks a lot, Jane, for all your help today and on everything else, and to all of you for taking the time and interest in the report. So it was fun.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Gordon. Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.